Hey MBA hopefuls, we are on air with MBA Waves, your weekly vidcast talking all things business and education, streaming live every Tuesday on LinkedIn, Facebook, and YouTube, bringing you tons of tips to help you get into the top ranked MBA program and getting you up close and personal with many of these schools that we host on the show, where you can get all your questions answered. And if you like this week's episode, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Today on episode 119, we have some interesting news. Bloomberg Business Week's biannual MBA rankings are out. So you're getting into Bloomberg rankings, the importance of rankings, and how to use these rankings to your advantage. As always, I'm your host, Krithika Srinivasan, joined by my co-host, Eric Lucrezia of Candidate Coach. Hey, Eric, how are you?
Good. How you doing?
Great. And we also have a very impressive list of guests today. Our friends and colleagues, Dr. Marlena Corcoran, a fellow admissions consultant, who is a regular on MBA Waves and founder of Athena Mentor, as well as Natalie Epstein, who's a first timer on MBA Waves from accepted.com. We were just discussing that between Natalie and Marlena, we have like over 60 plus years of experience in admissions consulting field itself. How cool is that? A big welcome to you both.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
Thank you.
Welcome, guys.
And jumping right in, let's take a look at the 2023-2024 Bloomberg Best Business Schools rankings today. Who made it to the top 10 and what are the surprises there? So over to you, Natalie.
Oh, okay. Surprises. You know what? With rankings, nothing ever really surprises me. They're like rankings. It was always a thorn in my side when I was an admissions director. There were so many of them. And quite frankly, while they can be used as a guide, they're not super accurate. Like how do you measure the strength of a school, right? So surprises are like some of the schools, like Harvard, not number one. Stanford made it in there, but Tuck, I'm not really sure they're the number 3 school, not to diminish what they have to offer, but quite frankly, if somebody were to get into Harvard and Tuck, the likelihood is they would choose Harvard over Tuck. So what does that say about these rankings?
Well, I have something to say about the rankings. I would suggest we could solve a lot or sidestep a lot of the problems that Natalie and others bring up by remembering that they are quantitative, not qualitative. It's not like I think that, but it's how did they score? And some of these scores are like figure skater scoring out to 2 decimal points on something that you might not care about. So I'm going to make a radical suggestion that instead of thinking of Bloomberg as the Bloomberg rankings, we start calling it the Bloomberg database. That way, instead of just saying it's a 1 to 10 thing, we can say Bloomberg went to a lot of trouble to gather data. We don't even have to subscribe. We don't have to go to a special terminal. We can just log on to the Bloomberg database and get all kinds of detailed, interesting information tailored to our particular interests right on the web.
I like you, phrase it, Marlena, because I think for once this particular rose called by a different name might actually make more sense.
And you had asked me, Krithika, about the factor of entrepreneurship. So what you need to know about the methodology of Bloomberg is there are 3 categories of data. They come from current students, which is actually the least important, from alumni who graduated within the last 3 years. So they're really feeling either the weight or the shortcoming of their education and the name of their school. And interestingly, employers who customarily hire MBAs. So there are those 3 categories. And on the other hand, there are 5 what Bloomberg calls indexes, things that are important in the education of any MBA. And they do include compensation. They also include learning. And Bloomberg is totally transparent about these categories on their website. And an interesting subset this year that made a lot of difference in the 1 to 10 rankings was the category entrepreneurship. As I said before, a lot of these numbers come out looking like figure skating, but the category entrepreneurship gave a clear advantage to Stanford over Harvard. There was, for a change, a significant difference, not a 0.02 difference. So in entrepreneurship, Stanford scored 89.6 and Harvard 81.5. And that compares to a lack of differentiation in, for example, compensation, which showed a 0.5% difference. And there are a number of things that Stanford is doing in entrepreneurship, notably a new program in combination with their sustainability school. And since that's such a hot topic these days, I think that helped push Stanford into place 1, which, by the way, is the place they have occupied for the last 5 years.
And I would suggest that they belong there, right? I mean, again, if we were to look at schools, like, would you select, again, Tuck over Stanford if you got into both? Most students would select Stanford over Tuck. So it's, do they belong in the number 1 spot? I would say yes, they belong in the number 1 spot. So,
well, I think the big question this year was, does Harvard belong in spot 6?
No.
And I would say this is, what we really should be thinking of is, does a school belong in the top 10? And I think that once you start ranking them within the top 10, it gets a little picky. And I would urge us to think of a comparison with something like the 10 Commandments. Is number 6 really much more important than number 4? And I'll bet you that most Jews and Christians couldn't even name which one is number 7, which one is number 3. They're all kind of important, and they belong in maybe the top 10 of ways to conduct your life or schools you should begin considering. But I think those careful 0.02 differentiators between 0.3 and 0.4 are simply not as important as other very legitimate reasons a candidate might have for choosing one school over another.
I would go further and say they mean very little at all. I mean, these decimal points, what does it mean? This is some kind of factor that you can multiply your worth or your professionalism or the salary you should earn? No. And these schools kind of fluctuate around each other. And the movement of this, you speaking about the 10 Commandments, made me think of that scene in Monty Python where Moses comes down. Here are the 15. Whoops, 10 Commandments. And it's just a nod to the, in a way, arbitrariness of this thing, if you think about it. I think it is useful, especially if you're at the beginning of your research and you want to see who are some of the key players out there in terms of schools you want to target. But, when something doesn't sit right with you as far as like, oh, does Harvard belong at 6 or does Tuck belong at 1 and so forth? I think that has a lot to do with just our own experience. Is Harvard, for example, is a household name almost globally speaking, and there's not many schools that can say that. But many other schools are doing fantastic things, producing great results, training people, have amazing networks, and have people coming out with amazing salaries. So I think these schools also deserve to have their moment shining in number one as well, which means everyone can't be number one in this ranking system. Which brings me to another point. Some people in our industry speak about maybe we should have more of a rating system, kind of like a Moody's, like A or AAA, or however you want to do it, like ABC kind of thing, or, like many schools could occupy the top rating position, whatever you want to call it, 5-star school, 4 stars, and so forth, as an alternative way of expressing quality. What do you guys think about that, of having a rating system versus a ranking system?
Is that going to sell more magazines? Right? I mean, really, the reason these rankings have done so well is they sell a lot of magazines. And so they change it up every year just a little bit. The rankings haven't been consistent in terms of what they measure. So, and when they compare year by year, that seems unfair because it's comparing apples versus oranges. So would a ranking system work? Yeah, I imagine it might, but then what happens when you're a 4.5 star, right? And you're not quite the 5-star. How do you make it into that 5-star? Students, applicants, companies will still want a differentiator. They still want to know which 5 schools we should recruit at. Students still want to know which 5 schools should I apply to. So if we're going to have 20 schools that are 5 stars, how do we guide someone in terms of what school is best for them, and do we use the right to do that?
For them is key.
For them.
That's
what we do.
Right. You bring up a valid point about, comparing apples to oranges if we're talking about year on year, because the methodologies can change year on year. And we've seen a couple of them change recently. But what is it? Because I was thinking about how I really like that report that I think Poets and Quants came up with it, which did kind of a 25-year spread across all since the beginning of the FT rankings, and who were the top 10 in the 25-year average. And Wharton came out on top of that. They had the most number ones, I suppose, or whatever the average somehow put them in the first category. That's interesting because you're seeing a longer view, right? But at the same time, if they're changing the methodology, maybe it's not fair or legitimate. Also, I could argue, as business evolves, laws evolve, technology evolves, it's maybe a good thing that methodology changes because our needs change as a society, as companies. So I don't know. I think it's interesting to look at, but don't give too much weight to it when you're choosing where you go.
Eric, I think the most interesting thing about that 25-year view from Poets and Quants is that the schools that consistently hit those top places and so showed up very high on that longitudinal scale are the MBA programs that are associated with powerful universities. And I think it's as much the weight of the traditional university as the excellence of the MBA program in particular that won certain schools an undeniable place in the history as well as the quote unquote ranking of MBA programs.
True.
I don't know how many of you have had the opportunity to do this, but I've actually had the opportunity to fill in ranks. So the Business Week alumni survey when I was an alum, and they were doing it 5 years out at that point. So I was in one of the first classes where it was a 5-year out questionnaire. And not with Business Week, but with US News, there's a component that is completed by a dean. So I sat with my associate dean and strategized over a glass of wine as to where we would want to rank our competitors. So the components that are really quite subjective can be manipulated as well. There can be a groundswell of encouragement for students to highly rank the school, particularly in Business Week, where they do have a significant amount of influence in terms of that ranking. And we've seen some anomalies happen over the years with the Bloomberg Business Week ranking because of that subjective measure, the student measure in particular. And if there's a groundswell from the students, then, let's not shoot ourselves in the foot. Let's rank ourselves highly. It's easy to get a school up. I mean, I remember when my own school, which is, I would say, safely in the top 10 typically, or 11, made it to number 2 for Bloomberg, and we had a huge celebration. Wasn't exactly I would say that US News typically has a little bit more weight than Bloomberg, at least here in the States, but there's a subjective part of this, and I'm wondering if you have opinions about the subjective issues involved in these rankings, because they're not all quantitative. It's not a pure quantitative play.
Well, Natalie, as you say, the student responses can determine a lot. And that's what we saw happen, that the lack of student response is what tanked Wharton in the Financial Times rankings earlier this year.
No, that's a great point, Marlena.
Not meeting their critical mass, that'll do you in. And it's just crazy to go from number 1 last year to non-existent this year. It's like, what does that mean? I mean, of course. Well, we also saw an anomaly during COVID, right? The M7 schools, all of them collectively in mafioso style, decided not to participate together in the 2021, I guess it would have been 21.
Right. Yeah, once rankings, yeah.
And about the M7, I wanted to ask you, Eric, how would your proposal differ from what we already have, at least informally, in the M7?
In terms of what I was saying about
ratings.
Yeah. So what Natalie was saying, schools would always maybe want to have a 4.5 or that kind of differentiation. I don't know. I mean, maybe that would be a thing. Maybe there's half stars. I mean, how precise do we want to go? If we're not taking it so seriously as this, it has to be, the top 3 schools or nothing, that you're choosing schools that are really about the right fit for you, that you're choosing schools because they have a long history of expertise and thousands of examples of alumni who are working in that field, or even better, at the company that you want to work at. I think that ends up being more important. Then you have the other kind of thing, especially for any kind of sponsored MBAs, where companies have a say in where they're going, where they're sending their people. They may insist on only 5-star schools if we're going this imaginary 5-star system. I mean, I haven't really thought through, do we want out of 5 or stars or hearts or clovers or whatever? They're always after me, Lucky Charms. All right. But yeah, I think something like that would be better than a ranking, because it's like pitting the schools against each other. And the only thing that I like about that, which I've said a bunch of times already, is that I think that rankings push schools to do better for their students and to be better. And I like that pressure that it puts on schools to come up with a better product, service, and so forth. I don't know what you guys think, if that actually has that impact or not, but
Eric, I'm going to argue that point with you, because I honestly think when rankings started populating the MBA admissions arena, the pressure was more about what can we do to manipulate the rankings. I was on that side. I was told by a dean that we needed to get into the top 25, and I needed to do anything that it took to do that. It was on me, admissions, to do that. And there are ways that you can manipulate your rankings. What?
It's just guerrilla marketing, right?
It is. It is. So, I mean, I would say that it hasn't pushed the schools to do that. it's pushed the schools to emphasize things that maybe shouldn't be emphasized, right? So
Also,
is a higher GMAT score, what does that mean in the context of the school success, the average GMAT score?
there's also, I mean, we think of numbers as the most pure, metric, right? The GMAT scores, it's numbers. You can't fake that, but there are ways to play with that for schools because they only have to
Absolutely.
report 70% of GMAT scores. So that allows for a certain margin of GMAT waivers. That allows for a certain margin of scores way below their average because the candidate has other great things about them. And the stupid test is not really what it's all about.
Right. And so is the pressure on for the admissions director to pick the student who has the high GMAT score, which is what, 6% of the ranking, versus picking a student that has a lower GMAT score who has a lot of other things to offer. And as a former admissions director, I would say that there was a lot of pressure on me to raise our average GMAT score so that our rankings would go up. And that is true for 2 of the 3 schools that I worked at. One, I had recommended, the one that wanted to get into the top 25, I had recommended paying for every student so that the yield would go up. And they did that for 3 years and they got into the top 25. So
Wow.
just saying, it can be done. It can be done. You can manipulate rankings, and to me, there's something like, I don't know, unholy about it.
Sure. I think it's also true that most schools have like a rankings department, like
Marketing. Yeah.
Yeah, but
Marketing.
A specific set of staff in the marketing team whose responsibility is to manage the rankings. That's
right.
Sending out the surveys to their alumni, but maybe also selecting certain ones, maybe massaging data as often massaged. So
I wanted to ask about, you had mentioned about the pressure that is there on schools, and definitely the margins by which these schools differ. So, what other concerns are there about rankings, and how much of importance should students allocate to it when it comes to business school selection?
Well, I'd like to make a point about arithmetic. It's kind of elementary, but we tend to forget it, which is that the more you average something out, the less meaningful the number is. And by the time you get up to averaging, well, what are we going to take for the top level score to do these top 10 rankings is virtually meaningless. However, for candidates, that detailed level of data can be very informative. And that's why I'll urge us again to think of this as the Bloomberg database, not the Bloomberg rankings. Because if a student wants a particular industry or even a particular employer, one really interesting thing I thought about the entrepreneurship factor for Stanford was that 81 of the 426 or so students, it really was 426, went into entrepreneurship. That's a very high percentage, given that the top 3 industries usually suck up everybody in a class. And I think it would be very hard to compete on that metric. But that also says something very meaningful to me about Stanford entrepreneurship. It may be you could get just as excellent training and networking in entrepreneurship at a different school, but it might not be the case that a quarter of your classmates, a fifth of your classmates would be planning on going in that direction. So that number says something meaningful about the culture of the school. It's very difficult to measure culture, but I think that particular number this year was meaningful.
I absolutely agree with you. You see that in the Financial Times as well. It has there's the main list, right? And there's the sub rankings where they have categories like best for entrepreneurship. And I think it's Babson that's is it 40 years in a row or something like that? Some insane number. I mean, that says something also. And often those sub rankings, I think, can have much more weight depending on what's important to you, your culture, values, learning style, and goals, than the main list. But thinking about like some regional stuff, like what do you guys what's your take on rankings mattering more for candidates who are applying for MBAs in Europe versus North America or Asia? Any thoughts on that?
Well, my main basis is in Munich. And so I was thinking of this when you said before, Eric, that employers are critical. Look at the employers. And that, I think, is another metric where to average it out globally isn't really meaningful, because I don't know a major employer in Germany who would turn up their nose at a graduate from St. Gallen in Switzerland. So what matters is that fine-grained analysis.
Mm-hmm. Natalie, anything to add?
No, I think Marlena's right on the nose. You use it as a guideline. And I love the idea of you calling it the database, right? Because that is what it is. It's their data, the way they wanted to slice and dice it. It's not an absolute. It's like rankings are pretty organic, and you can look at them over the years. There hasn't been a lot of change. Like if you look at the changes, it's really minute. And if we look at like Eric's idea of maybe, doing a Moody's kind of thing, you'll see the same schools with the same scores, because as an aggregate, the M7 is still going to be the M7. Maybe a Yale will creep up there. Maybe a Tuck, maybe a Ross, maybe a Johnson will creep up there, or Darden. But it's the M7s have been around for a long time. They've been meeting since the 1960s, and together, and they're a pretty powerful bunch. After that, it's interesting. After that, the data gets really interesting, particularly schools on the periphery of the top 20. So those schools have been, clawing at it for a really long time. When they drop out, they've got to get right back in. So, so that's where the interesting data falls.
Yeah, and that's where you see spread in the numbers that you don't see at the top.
Right, exactly. Yeah, they may switch places. Yeah, Wharton might switch places with Harvard. Yeah, Stanford might switch places with, with MIT, but it's rare. I mean, if they're switching places, it's still within that. There's
like a kind of bands that they kind of move up and down with.
There are bands, and one of our colleagues a while back wrote a book using those bands. I mean, it may have been, I don't know, 6-7 years ago, where he wrote something about using bands of schools. It doesn't get into what we can do for students, though. I mean, it is so important that the student, the applicant, find the school that's going to be great for them, not the school that's highest ranked, the school that's going to be great for them. And a lot of students will argue with me, well, those schools aren't recognized in my country. They have a really valid claim there.
Yeah.
There are plenty of other schools that are recognized in the country. So we find the schools that are going to help that student the most.
I agree with you.
That company.
Where we can do any good. And that's where an admissions counselor has deep knowledge that is not typical of I can name the top 5 schools in the FT.
Yeah. So So, what is one thing you would want applicants to do when it comes to using these rankings correctly?
I would want them to know that the data is there behind those primary number, what do you call them? The first 10 numbers. Most of them, I think they don't even know that the data is there.
Or have time to look at it. Like they want to,
It doesn't
and
take
it's okay.
long.
Right. It's okay that we do that for them, though, where we can say, you know what, let's look at these companies that are recruiting at the school and what they think of the school, as opposed, like, so that's something we know as admissions coaches, counselors, consultants, right? This is information we have that we can share with you so that we can find schools that meet your profile, that share your values, that will get you to where you want to go, that will be meaningful for your goals, not just post MBA goals immediately, but in the future. What is that network going to do for you in the future?
Based on your specific needs, goals, and targets.
Exactly.
Absolutely. That's the
And
real.
Eric, again, about the choices that European students make. The university to which the program belongs matters a lot once you leave the country, because there may not be a group of MBA graduates from, let's take Yale School of Management. There may not be a lot of those in Munich. And as a matter of fact, there aren't even a lot of Yale graduates in Munich. But something I did 20 years ago now was to get together those orphan alumni groups and make an Ivy League unit. So I organized, it was called first Brown Ed Oktoberfest, and then was the All Ivy Oktoberfest. And all of the Cornell hoteliers came because they tend to be very sociable. So suddenly we had a critical mass of interesting people. And I think if you're outside the United States, that counts for a lot.
Absolutely. Good move on getting the Cornell hotelier people there.
Or a riot.
Yeah. All right. Well, we have a little bit more time before we wrap it up. I wanted to ask, what do you make of a school that is ranked very differently between two or more different ranking systems? Like, how do you advise your clients to understand what that means or what to make of it? Marlena, you want to take it first? Since you're
It's a perfect teachable moment to show, well, the criteria were different. Here's what the criteria were. Here's how it came out.
anything to add, Natalie?
I just, say take rankings with a grain of salt and use them as a guide, but not an absolute, right? It's really important that you find a school that's going to meet your criteria, and a school whose values match your own, and the school that's going to get you to where you want to go. So let's use them as guidelines, and not absolutes, and try to figure out, as Marlena said, what the numbers are behind the numbers so that you are making informed decisions.
Yep, absolutely. And what I often just to add to that is look at the methodology. I mean, like each of these rankings uses a different methodology, and looking at the one that maybe most aligns with what's important to you is useful to think about as well.
Yeah, and I think that's where admissions consultants really help save people time, because we have done that once for everybody so that people don't need to reinvent the wheel, although they can. And I think that the database is empowering in that regard. And the database is just very different from what Natalie had spoken about before, just people's general idea of which schools are important. And in that regard, I can't leave today without discussing the dinner party rankings, which is what I call what everybody's mother would say is school number one or number two, or at the next dinner party would be delighted to say, oh, well, my son or daughter is going to fill in the blank. And there, I would say Harvard has nothing to worry about in coming out number 6 in this year's Bloomberg. And I'll use St. Gallen again as an example. No one's mother would hesitate to brag at the next dinner party that her daughter has been accepted at St. Gallen.
For sure.
The prestige that we allocate to rankings is a lot. And which brings me to this question about when should rankings come into play during the school research and selection process? Is it during the time of application and when they're deciding where to apply, or is it when they get the offers on hand?
I think it's at the application stage. I don't think it's when you're making your decision on offers. On offers, you need to get a really good sense of, am I going to thrive at that school? So attending the admit student weekends are really important. And if you can't be there, go to the virtual admit student weekends, talk to as many students as possible, both students who are going to be your peers, as well as the students that are currently in the program. That's something I have all of my clients do beforehand anyway. Like, do the research, talk to students, talk to alumni. They can also open doors for you later on. So I don't think the rankings should have as much to do with the final decision as it should to narrow down your scope in terms of where you're going to apply.
And so just to wrap things up, is there an ideal ranking? We talked about a couple of different models, but at the conclusion of this discussion, what would the ideal ranking be? Or maybe it's no ranking at all.
The one you make as an applicant.
Yes. It's the For You rankings. And I think that the step just before that is, of course, the dinner party rankings, because local prestige means a lot. And that should be sort of your biggest social group before you get to you, yourself, personally, not what anybody in your neighborhood wants or would be impressed by. But by this time, you should have a sufficient knowledge of the school to know that that's a good place for you.
And it's all about going deep on the research. And this just takes time. It takes a lot of time. And you can, well, I'd say cut that time down a lot by working with a professional. But still, you know, like Marlena, you were speaking about kind of why reinvent the wheel when it comes to like understanding the data. And yes, but when it comes to the researching the schools, I never want to do that work for my clients. I'll send them on the right direction. But that process of going through the website and speaking to people, alumni, current students, and so forth, they really have to go on that journey, because it's like you glean so much more than what you're actually looking for. Like, you go to the website looking for one piece of data or one fact or one point of interest, and you end up discovering so many other things. You get a sense of the culture and the vibe, and it's so important as well. So I never would take that away from my clients.
And that's what, when people get excited about schools they didn't realize they would get that excited about. And that, I think, is one of the joys of working with applicants.
Totally.
It's about envisioning being in that school. And as you said before, Marlena, knowing if you belong there. So I think that matters a lot. So that's all the time we have for this episode. There was a lot of, discussion around the importance of rankings. I want to thank our featured guests, Marlena and Natalie, for their amazing insights today, and all our guests in the audience. It was such a pleasure to hear from them. MBA hopefuls, if you liked today's episode, Please give us a little thumbs up. Be sure to subscribe to MBA Waves to stay on top of all the latest trends and news in the world of MBAs, business, and education. Bye.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.